The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A new project puts the Coast Salish Wooly Dog in the spotlight. The Teachings of Mutton is a book from Liz Hammond-Kaareema and a variety of Coast Salish contributors. The Coast Salish Wooly Dog was a now extinct breed of dog with white fur and pointed ears. Today on the show, we'll hear some stories about the dog's place in Coast Salish culture. Three of the contributing authors to the Teachings of Mutton joined me to speak about the project.
Hi, I'm Liz Hammond-Kaareema. I live on Protection Island, and I worked at VIU, and I'm a research associate still there and at the Smithsonian. And my co-authors and I are delighted to be here and to talk about the book and the stories in the book.
Hello, everyone. My name is Violet Elliot. My Huamo Snat is Snemethea. I come from Nanaimo First Nations. That's what Indianac says I'm from. My grandparents were from Stamanis, Penelakut, Cowichan. I have a bit of Hawaiian and some Portuguese in me. I am an avid weaver, very connected historically to Wooly Dog, and I'm happy to be here.
Siamna Siaya, Anthape Qualasalton Tanitsanakls Nanaimo, Paits Epka Quanzalips Kakipatanaquel. Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot Whitehill Qualasalton. I'm an artist and storyteller from the Nanaimo First Nation, and my family has roots in Penelakut and in Hoopachesit in the Nuchanoth world. And I'm really grateful to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Well, Liz, Violet, Elliot, thank you all so much for being here. We're here today to talk about Coast Salish Wooly Dogs, and our weigh-in is one specific Coast Salish Wooly Dog. Liz, could you tell me a little bit about that?
Okay, the Coast Salish Wooly Dog as a breed don't exist now, but in 1858, a fellow by the name of George Gibbs, who was American, and he was working for the U.S. Border Survey crew. They were placing the border markers along the 49th parallel, and he acquired a dog in either 57 or 58 from the Chilliwack area, and he named the dog Mutton. And when the dog died, the dog was only about 18 months old when it died, and we know it had been sick before it died. He also worked with this, what's now called the Smithsonian, the National Museum. He and another fellow, a doctor on the survey team, collected mammals, plants, rocks, fish, and sent them to the Smithsonian. And so when Mutton died, George Gibbs knew how important woolly dogs were, and so he sent Mutton's pelt to the Smithsonian, where it lay in a drawer for something like 150 years before being rediscovered and brought back to everybody's knowledge now.
And a lot of the knowledge that has come out of that pelt, some of it maybe, if it's fair to use the word, like reawakened or uncovered almost in a way, that is chronicled in this new book you have coming out. It's called The Teachings of Mutton. Everyone here who's joining me is a contributor to that work. Violet, maybe, could you tell me, when you found out about this project that it was going to happen, what was your reaction? How did you come into this?
Oh, yeah. My Aunt Geraldine, Liz works alongside her quite regularly. She asked me to be part of the Wooly Dog Committee. So there was a Wooly Dog Committee, and it comprised of all parties that were connected in some way. A lot of us weavers were asked from all over to be part of it, and that's why I believe I was asked to be a part of it, is because of the weaving. I was so ecstatic. It really felt to me like Wooly Dog was determined not to be forgotten. And that journey started way back in the 1850s. And there's a whole history that's connected to it that I'm very, very, very proud of. And I'm ecstatic that Wooly Dog is making his debut.
Are there any parts of how Wooly Dog is connected to weaving that you'd be willing to share with us today?
The Wooly Dog, it was connected to our royalty. So our people who were hereditary status, our hereditary chiefs, it's prior to contact, hereditary chiefs could have many wives. So then they would have many weavers. And then their daughters would become weavers. And you've seen a picture, and the hereditary chief is standing on the rafters, and a blanket is being dropped into the people. Well, the weavers wove that in such a way it'll come apart in 4 to 6 pieces. Men are going to run at that blanket, and they're going to tug a war over it. And you wanted that piece of the blanket for the warmth, but it also had high trade value. I want you to think about our woolly blankets like our money, okay? And so I imagine the excitement of all of those men running at that blanket and hoping that they would have that. If you look at the rafters of the old pictures, there is a lot of woolly dog, mountain goat blankets there. And so that's exciting. And you see there's a picture from Nanaimo where the hereditary chief is standing on the rafters. You see it in Cowichan. I think that's our next job, is to pull out any other black and white pictures we can find of hereditary chiefs standing with a lot of blankets. In 1912, there's hereditary chiefs. They're all donning. They're from all over. They're from Duncan here. They're from Capilano. They're from Haida Gwaii. They're from the West Coast. They're all donning mountain goat woolly dog blankets. These are all hereditary chiefs. It's 1912. They're getting ready to get on a ship. They're going to go to Europe to petition the king for their land. So that's an epic picture for us that shows how we wore these mountain goat, what they meant to us. Hereditary chiefs were held up in high regard, and they were donned in these garments.
You talk there about the importance of the woolly dog blankets. In the book, Liz, you chronicle this period in kind of the scientific community where there are people who are kind of casting doubt on, like, is it even possible to make a blanket with dog fur? I don't think so. And then you show how some of the science is advanced to the point where we say, yeah, look, no, we have confirmed that there is absolutely woolly dog hair in this blanket. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that process of like the kind of the doubt that was cast on this thing that all of these people were saying for a long time, and there was a ton of evidence.
So the indigenous people knew forever that the woolly dog existed and was part of their history and culture. Non-indigenous people had doubts. In a weaving book, a really good weaving book. I don't want to cast doubt on this book, but the author cast doubt because she only saw certain types of dogs, and she didn't think the hair was spinnable. She looked at blankets in North America and in Europe, and she couldn't see what she thought would be woolly dog. And as the science developed, better microscopes, DNA analysis, isotope analysis, and she felt science was very important. And at that time, the science wasn't good enough to identify dog wool, so she doubted it, even though in the museum records, whoever collected the blanket had said there is dog wool in it, so she still had doubts. So a couple of years ago, the advisory committee, we worked with some DNA researchers at the Smithsonian, and they were able to take the DNA of mutton and analyze it. And they could say, well, with mutton's ancestry, I think so we only have one sample, but with mutton's ancestry, his lineage goes back at least 2,000 years, more likely 5,000 years. And if we had more dog samples, we could be more accurate, might go back further. And one of the researchers said it was very clear from the DNA that the dog, it didn't come from Asia, it didn't come from Europe, it was bred into being in Coast Salish territory. So that was very exciting. And then about 10 years ago, another researcher looked at 11 blankets that the Smithsonian had, and she identified, I think 7 blankets had some dog wool in a component, maybe mixed with mountain goat, or maybe just in the fringe, or just in the warp. But she identified 11 blankets that did have dog hair in it.
Now, Elliot, you're an artist, and you share in the book a number of stories that you have heard about woolly dogs here in Nanaimo. And I'm wondering if you could tell me anything about maybe how some of those have informed some of your work as an artist, if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting because, growing up in Nanaimo and being raised by my family, I actually didn't know about the woolly dog until I started making art and looking at the work of other Coast Salish artists, doing research about Coast Salish culture. And that's how I started to learn about the woolly dog. It was written about in some books, and especially the work of Sinakula Weiss really was contributing to people knowing about the woolly dog. And so that's when I started asking questions in my community, asking people. And it was like Elder Gary Manson, Cholsimalt, Dr. Willie Goods, Askinachan. These two really shared some stories about the woolly dog in Nanaimo with me. And, from there, I realized how significant it is to us in Nanaimo. Like Cameron Island, one of the places downtown where the towers are right next to the Gabriola Ferry. In our language, we call that place Squeakme. And Squeakme means little dogs. And what that says to me is that island was a dog sanctuary for the village site downtown. And it totally lines up with what Violet was saying, because the village site that was downtown was called Salachwal, and they were known to be the highest ranking and the wealthiest village in Nanaimo prior to contact. So it totally lines up that they would have had, a lot of woolly dogs, and probably would have had this entire island dedicated to looking after them. So, it was really interesting because through the woolly dog, I was able to learn more about Nanaimo culture and history. And through my art practice, it's all storytelling for me. And so being able to tell those stories, to share it with other people, to make sure that, future generations of Nanaimo have access to that knowledge and those teachings through the art that I make is really important to me. So it's been a really exciting kind of story to tell and to help unravel with everybody working together on this book.
One of the contributors mentioned during the book that when we just talk about dogs nowadays, we all sort of have these preconceptions or this very particular image of like, this is the role dogs play in our life today in 2025. And someone was wondering in the book, how would the woolly dog be different? Or like, what are we missing if we're just thinking about the woolly dog in that way? And I'm wondering if any of you three really have any reflections on that idea or that question.
I'd like to speak to it a little bit. We would have kept the dogs, like Elliot is saying, would have kept the dogs on an island separate from other dogs. They would have been considered chacha in our language, which is sacred. And so we would be one with those dogs. Those dogs would be one with us. We would keep them separate from other dogs. I want to actually equivocate it and say they were high-standing dogs to our people. And like that is probably the best way to describe them. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could continue what Violet said. One thing that I found really incredible that I learned when I was studying Halkamenim language at the Nanaimo Language Academy was that our teacher, Donna Gertz, she told me that there's a different pronoun used for woolly dogs specifically in Halkamenim. And it's that we, instead of referring to them as animals, we refer to them as people, as family members. And I found that really interesting because that shows how important they were and how elevated they were.
And to add on to that, I think we have to think of them differently than as what modern day we would think of a dog as a pet. And although the dogs were loved, it's more than being a pet. And I think that what they said about it being a high status dog is probably a good way to think about the dogs.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
We've been talking about the Coast Salish Wooly Dog on today's program. Several sources suggest the dogs, which are now extinct, experienced a severe population decline in the 1850s. The pelt of one Coast Salish Wooly Dog that was lying in a drawer in the Smithsonian for more than 150 years inspired a research project that brought together knowledge holders from a variety of Coast Salish communities. That project has resulted in a new book called The Teachings of Mutton. Liz Hammond-Kaareema, Violet Elliot, and Elliot Whitehill all contributed to that book, and they've joined me today to talk about Coast Salish Wooly Dogs. Now, one of the big threads of this book is sort of the mystery of what exactly happened to this one dog, Mutton. And I don't want to give away what you found out, but Liz, would you maybe just be able to tell me about that journey of coming in and you find out that there's this pelt, and then really no one knows a lot about what actually happened to this dog?
Yes. George Gibbs wrote a lot of journals. He had a journal for recording the weather, the amount of rainfall. He had another journal about notes. So if he ran into somebody on the trail, he would say, what's around the corner? What animals do you find in this area? What's the local word for XYZ? So he wrote all this down, but he never wrote anything about mutton until one line towards the very end, but I'm not going to say what that is. Keep the mystery. But it was interesting that at the time he got Mutton, the dogs were disappearing. And quite a few people actually wrote about that. A fellow who came to Nanaimo in the early 1850s said that there was lots of dogs. You went into a lodge and sometimes there was just as many dogs as people in that particular lodge at the time that he went in. And yet within 10 years, somebody else wrote that the dogs were disappearing. And this was another person from the Nanaimo area. So they did disappear very shortly after. But when they looked at Mutton, so he was acquired in 57, 58, his DNA showed that he had one ancestor, a grandfather or great-grandfather, we're not sure which, or a grandmother, who was a European dog. But considering that contact was already here, things were changing, the fact that Mutton didn't have more meant that he was very special, and they still kept the Coast Salish Wooly Dogs as special dogs right up through the 1850s.
And there's a thread to this as well. You talk about the way that museums store things or museums treat things, and you talk about this idea of like artifacts, and maybe some of the data we cataloged or we did 100 years ago, or maybe up until very recently, kind of missed some of the things that actually make the items important, some of their connections to human beings. And I'm wondering if you could share some reflections on your thoughts on that during this process.
And then I think Elliot can talk a bit more about that, because he's curated an exhibit, and he's curating an exhibit for the Field Museum in Chicago. But the one key point that I think people should think about is these aren't just objects, they're belongings. They belong to somebody. And in that belonging, they have stories. And it's the stories that are just as important, if not more important, than the actual thing that's in the museum.
So, Elliot, how did you approach that idea as you look at the task of curating an exhibit?
I think for me, with museum collections and kind of navigating and grappling with the archive, it was one of the first realizations that I made when I started really trying to learn more about Coast Salish culture after my great grandma passed away, and looking at our art and looking at our ancestral cultural belongings that have been taken from us and now sit in collections around the world. And it's that there are so many barriers in the way of us accessing knowledge about ourselves, and that, these institutions and museums, the collection practices were not good. It was very disorganized. Very rarely is there proper documentation of where things come from. In the case of mutton, where mutton's pelt, the paperwork was lost in a fire, I think, or damaged, and so they had no idea where it actually was until somebody showed up with a number. Um, it's really, this is the reality for so many indigenous peoples, that, the settlers and colonizers came here and pillaged and plundered all of our sacred things. And for us to access them, we have to travel across the planet. Um, there's a lot of talk about repatriation and how meaningful that is. And, I always think about the example of my own family in Hoopachesset. We have two potlatch screens, painted panels that came from our family, from our house in Hoopachesset. And they're in the American Museum of Natural History right now. And they've been there for over 100 years now. And those potlatch screens are part of who I am, being from this family, being from this house. And when you visit the museum, you see them on the wall, you don't understand what they are. You don't see them being danced and sang in front of. You don't see them being used in potlatch. You only see this kind of object there that's in this museum context. And so without seeing them in their proper context, you can't understand what they are. And for me, as a Hoopachesset, I can't understand who I am while those objects are in New York. So there's this really complex and frankly devastating tension of looking and working with museum collections. But what we're doing is also creating access to that knowledge and breaking those barriers down and making sure that it's not going to be so hard for the next people who come after us, the next future generations who come after us, to do this work. And so yeah, for me, with the Wooly Dog work and sharing this story, that's part of what's so powerful about it, is sharing it from our own perspective and leaving this legacy for future generations, bringing those stories back to the surface. So that's a little bit of a rant about museums from me there, but just had to say it.
Well, tying in to that idea of creating something accessible that people can look through in the form of this book and see stories and keep the stories alive in a way that's not like locked behind some glass in some museum you have to pay to enter. Violet, I'm wondering if you could tell me what you hope people will take away when you decided to share in this project. What were the big things you wanted to come out of that? What are the things you hope someone would take away from reading through the book?
I think big time, I want people to understand that we were a people that were intact. We had societies, we had laws, we had governance, we had all of those things in place. And before settlers arrived, we were a highly social people. And I really feel like what this book did was it brought weavers right from Vancouver Island to the mainland down into the U.S. They brought all of us weavers together. And I want to tell you that's been really good medicine. And I want all the teachings that come from mutton, but not just mutton, woolly dogs, is there's a grand history attached to it. I get emotional when I think about it because it's like through mutton, Wooly Dog decided I'm going to do a debut, and people are going to know the history of what Wooly Dogs meant to us as a people. And I'm just so excited. I'm just so excited that it brought all of us weavers together that way. We're going to get to tell. The perfect example is what Elliot just did. He talked about what was taken away from us, while Wooly Dog in the By Way of Mutton is allowing us to come and tell our truths, to tell what actually happened. And that's exciting.
Liz, Violet, Elliot, is there anything that you feel it's really important to bring to this conversation or to let people know about the story of Mutton, the story of this project, Coast Salish Wooly Dogs, that we haven't discussed today?
I think one thing is the Mutton's actual story by itself is one thing, but this book, it gets all its meaning from the Coast Salish co-authors, because they've put in their hearts and souls about their personal history, their family history, their culture, and they create the context for the Coast Salish Wooly Dogs. So that gives the book a lot of meanings, and I think I hope it opens the door for people that don't know much about the culture to start learning about the culture, and it's sort of like a one door, one entrance way into reconciliation. It's a start anyway.
I would just like to follow that, Liz. Thank you for that. I would just like to follow it with even back in the 1850s, they thought our people were dying. We were going to die off. There were going to be no more Indigenous people left in the world. So there was this gathering of things. Mutton became one of those things. They were gathering. I want to say this. What else it brings about is we did not die. We're still here as a people. We're still very proud. We're very proud of our history. That was everything was done to take our history and our culture and our spirituality away from us. And Mutton, Wooly Dog, said, no, not today.
I think one of the most exciting things as well about this whole project, and going back to the initial research paper that was published in Science magazine, is just the way that everyone has come together and is holding up Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing on par and on the same playing field in the same light as scientific and academic research. That's just something that has not happened nearly enough. And it's really transformative work, for people to see this happening, for people to see this as a model of what can happen in the future for different projects. So that's something to me that has been just really, really exciting to be participating in through all of this. Just
one more note. We are giving a presentation at the Nanaimo Museum on Saturday the 31st at 1 o'clock. And it's in Eventbrite, and there's no cost. But if you can register, so we just know how many seats to put out. But we'll all be speaking at that event too. Liz, Elliot, Violet, thank you all so much for taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Liz Hammond-Kaareema, Violet Elliot, and Elliot Whitehill are all authors on The Teachings of Mutton, a new book which shares the history of the Coast Salish Wooly Dog. As Liz mentioned there, the three of them will be doing a launch event at the Nanaimo Museum Saturday, May 31st. You can find more information about that event in the show notes for this episode. That's on our website, chly.ca/Midcoast Morning. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Fruit is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.